So going into the war, Germany could call up around 3,800,000 men. Imagine that. In 1914, Germany was able to call up close to 4 million men, and the French as well. One of the reasons why the French and the British were so happy to see American troops landing in 1917 was because they thought that they were going to get all those fresh bodies and use them the way they had been using them. General Pershing had a different sort of thing in mind. Some of the posters that were used for recruitment. And obviously the appeal to patriotism, nationalism, all kinds of subtle messages in here. Isn't this worth fighting for? Line up, boys, enlist today. You don't want to be one of the ones left out. Are you in this? Almost an accusation. It's a question, but almost in an accusing form. Given the milieu of the time, of course it says the empire needs men. But rest assured that during World War I, as in World War II, you have mass numbers of men deploying to the battlefield and a good number of women deploying to the front areas as well. In the home front, things begin to happen on the home front that change lives for women, not just during war, but after the war as well. The Selective Service Act in the U.S. was passed on May 18th, or became effective on May 18th, 1917. And here you see a blindfolded Newton Parker, Secretary of War, drawing the first draft number. So an American poster showing some recruitment verb. What message do you get from this? What do you all gather from this? As you look at this, what is it saying to you? Pride, okay? And honor? Sacrifice, duty, pride, honor, sacrifice, duty. All those are really great sounding words and adjectives, aren't they? Yeah. What else? Mother giving up her son, i.e. sacrifice. If a mother is going to give up her son, what's the matter with you? Every bracket you're doing are brave men at the front. Okay, so if you're not at the front, what are you not? We mentioned the last time that it was truly a global conflict. We took a look at some of the different weapon systems, the gas masks, the carnage of the war, the effect of barbed wire. Now, a World War I gas mask, then a more modern version. Now, this actually is not as modern as it is today. I mean, this is like maybe, probably about maybe 15 years ago, when they were still using the woodland pattern camouflage. This is when we were supposed to be fighting the Soviet Union, but of course that never happened, thank God. But just look at this. Imagine wearing this kind of getup, this kind of outfit, and carrying your full combat load, and carrying your rifle, and carrying your water, and carrying your ammunition, and carrying a radio. Can we agree that that's uncomfortable? Somebody mentioned during the last session about the big artillery weapons. This is, I think, after we dismissed. And there was a gun that the Germans had called Big Bertha. They had tremendously large artillery weapons. And the artillery barrages during World War I became famous for lasting not just for moments, but for hours at a time. Hours, sometimes for a day or longer. Let me give you an example of the difference between at least how Americans have done this and how Europeans have done this, specifically the Soviet Union. While on active duty in the Marine Corps, we were taught that American fire missions in an artillery battalion are like this. You have an 8 or 10 digit grid coordinate. So Americans want to drop the round right down on this target right there, in the rabbit hole. Yes, in the rabbit hole. If the rabbits are home, they're in trouble. Whereas the Soviet Union, they would say, look, they take on a map, they'll take a grid square, 1,000 meters square, and drop everything they've got in that 1,000 meters. Rabbits, squirrels, everybody's done. It's called suppression fire, grid suppression fires. If you take all of this, the barrages, the dropping bombs from the air, and again, think about this again now. In 2014, of course, when we hear things about ISIS, we say, well, the president has authorized bombing strikes. In other words, warfare from the air. It's no big deal for today, but imagine at a time when people are just getting used to the idea of flying. So I'm just getting used to the idea of flying, and now you're dropping bombs on me too? That's a lot to digest. I mentioned that the USS Navy has some big dirigibles, the rigid airships, and Akron, their air dock there is still standing. By the way, I didn't give you all the full information on the air dock. The air dock is still standing. It's been registered as a National Historical Site by the National Archives. What it's used for today, on occasion, you'll notice there are no internal structures, no pylon or anything on the inside holding it up. Different golf companies will come by there every now and then, and they'll hit balls from one end to the other because there's no wind in there. So it gives them an idea to see how fast the balls can go, how far they'll fly, how straight they are. So if nothing else, is good for golf practice. And again, to give you an idea of how big the rigid airships were, if you compare the scale of this one over Manhattan Island. And I mentioned to you all the last time that type of aerial bombardment would give way to the Ju-87 Stukas at the beginning of World War II, and then eventually the great air campaigns. The British found out early in the war that daylight precision bombardment was very costly. The Americans, Henry H. Arnold and Company, decided that was how they wanted to fight their war. The British eventually adopted round-the-clock nighttime saturation bombing, while the Americans had daylight precision air bombardment, and it was round-the-clock. Before the war was over, there were 1,000 plane raids. Clearly the lines between what's a target and what is not a target, what is available as far as who's to be killed relative to who's working in a factory, combatant or civilian, those lines have been blurred into non-existence. And it was a vicious, vicious air war, World War II. World War I also gives way to, in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, which of course changes history. Now it's October, November 1917, there's a February Revolution, but the actual Bolshevik Revolution, the one where things begin to happen, that if you will, the beginning of the Civil War, is right around 1917, of course. In 1918, the Russians will sign with the Germans something called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, this is in March. The war, except for the polar bear expedition, ends in November. Now, what this does, when the Russians agree, when they make a treaty with the Germans that basically pulls the Russians out of the war, this sets up, it not only does it anger the French and the British, but it basically guarantees the Russians being a pariah state for the next decade or two, in addition to the fact that they're Bolsheviks, socialists, communists. I don't know how many of you know, but in addition to Lenin being an ideologue, in addition to Lenin being a Marxist, and clearly he had read Karl Marx, clearly he meant to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, but Lenin also, just to add a little human element to this, Lenin also, one wonders what would have happened had not the Tsarist regime killed Lenin's brother. Because up until that point, Lenin was just one of many revolutionaries in Russia. But then the Tsarist secret police arrested his brother, whom he loved dearly, and killed him. Lenin, an individual, obviously cannot get back at the Tsar. So what he'll do to get the Tsar is kill the regime. And in killing the regime, he gets the Tsar as well. There's an element of family angst, anxiety, grieving in this whole process. What happens, though, is that over the course of time, Lenin, of course, has some of his lieutenants, Joseph Vissarionovich Dugashvili, also known as Stalin, who eventually becomes the leader of the Soviet Union during World War II. The importance of the Soviet Union during World War II cannot be overstated. This is a map that I sometimes show my students to give them an idea of just how close the lights on civilization nearly went out. In 1942, if you'll take a look at Moscow, where that red area is, it looks like from Spain all the way going east. The continent is either dominated directly by Nazi troops or those troops forces sympathetic to the Nazis. That's how close we came. We mentioned also about Eugene Burton Ely. And I think I mentioned to you all that at this stage of his experiment, he might have been having second thoughts about flying off of ships. We also mentioned that it worked. Eugene Burton Ely's experimentation gave way to aircraft carriers. The modern day, of course, type F-14 here, but more specifically for our purposes, the Japanese made use of these things very effectively on December 7, 1941. This was the command, the chief planner strategist was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. And when asked by Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe in mid-1941 concerning the outcome of a possible war with the United States, Yamamoto made a well-known and prophetic statement. In order to fight, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years. If you do the math on this, December 7, 1941, okay, we took a pretty good shot. January, February, March, April, May, June. June 4 through 6, 1942, the Battle of Midway. At least 5 of the 6 attack aircraft carriers who hit Pearl Harbor were either sunk or damaged. There was still 3 more years of war to fight, but at that point, the Japanese offensive war in the Pacific became a defensive war to manipulate public opinion. One of the criteria for fighting a world war. You need to use propaganda. You need to demonize your enemy. So we've seen the first set of posters that were targeting or addressing the issue of recruitment and enlistment, building that army. Now, to engage in the deeper passions of people. This is what provides you the emotional motive power to keep people sacrificing, to keep them disciplined during the rationing, to let them know that we're all in this together. That's a life and death struggle. Them or us. That's the thing about nationalism. It's very simple, it appeals to the deepest emotions, and it's very easy to organize. Do your duty. Beat back the Hun with the bloody bayonet there. And of course the phase, dark, which gives you all kinds of connotations. Destroy the mad brute. And just in case you don't understand that he's a mad brute, we'll draw him to look like a brute. This whole narrative of these last 2, it not only is sending a message about the demonic, maniacal nature of the enemy, but also what is this, what is this fight all about? We are fighting to protect our home. We're fighting to protect our women and our children. In other words, we're fighting to protect the weakest elements of our society, our civilization. So on the one hand, while it may be good to say, this is what we're fighting for to protect, at the same time it's reinforcing some notions about gender and roles in society that we'll still have to contend with after the conflict is over. This is a rather interesting one. I just look at this every time. British Empire Union. Once a German, always a German. Remember, every German employee means a British worker idle. Every German article sold is a British article unsold. When you learn to fight a world war, your government more than likely will have to experiment with price, wage, and rent controls, rationing, regulation of imports, exports. For those of you who remember the 1977 oil gas prices, the oil embargo, remember how the price of gas just kind of went up overnight? Or went up, every hour seemed to go up, the gas lines? Why was that? I'm amazed by it today. Every time some oil tanker hits a jellyfish in the Indian Ocean, the gas goes up. But the reason why governments get involved in doing this is because it is the nature of human beings in a stressful or in a crisis environment, meaning wartime, to hoard, to gouge, price gouge. And this is one way. How are you going to get people to enlist and do it for the cause if they're getting ripped off and reduced to paupers in the process? Now, think about this. In order for our government to be able to control the prices and make sure that people are not charging more than what they should, and we only can guess who's determining what the should be. In order for our government to be able to establish rent controls, regulate imports and exports, does that not sound to you like an expansion of governmental power? Doesn't it? This is also a feature of modern industrialized warfare. National mobilization from top to bottom, A to Z. And also learn to fight a modern war, a world war, The distinction between soldier and civilian narrows till it blurs. The expansion of government police powers. Arresting those. Have you ever heard of the phrase, loose lips sink ships? They're very popular during World War II. Our intelligence apparatus today, the debates going on in the courts about how much should the NSA be allowed to listen in on our conversations. Honestly, I'll tell you the truth. When I see everything my sons post on Facebook, I think the NSA is the least of our problems. He's just giving his information away. Unemployment is significantly reduced because, and I don't know how we get around this, but during World War I, you needed arms and weapons, and so armaments manufacturing, somebody had to make them. If a good population, if a good portion of your male population, the traditional bred, would have gone off to fight on the front, you still got to produce the weapons. So this means that women step in to that role. And in the United States, you have in 1950 something called the Great Migration, where black and white people from the South are coming north to places like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Cleveland, Milwaukee, to work in these defense armaments industries. And with women finding themselves more in the workplace, they're demanding equal pay in 1914-15 and in 2014 too. Now, this is from World War II. I just wanted to illustrate, but just to make the point, what a lot of people don't realize is that during World War II, at that aircraft plant, where that air dock was, where I showed you all, it'll be women who make 4,000 of these aircraft, the F-4U Corsair, which basically puts the final nail in the coffin of the Japanese air campaign, the Japanese Army and Navy during World War II. So you deal with machine guns, tanks, gas, barbed wire, submarines. Your notion of what's fair and not fair has changed. You know, what's noble and what's not noble is just blurred into non-existence. Now, if you're like those three young boys and all quiet on the Western Front, you're just trying to keep your skin. Never mind what the Kaiser says. You're just trying to stay alive. You just want to go home. You just want to live the next day. You're suffering bombardments. You're living in trenches that have rats coming through them. You have trench foot. You saw pictures of those the last time. There's cholera, there's dysentery. There's all kind of things there. In addition to the fact that occasionally somebody tells you to go over the top. And if you're not very careful, in addition to all that, and we haven't even gotten to the part yet where someone's going to shoot you and kill you. In addition to all of that, there was something else that began to happen during World War I that doctors had encountered before, but they didn't have words to describe it until
during the First World War, a new condition emerged that caught the military and medical establishment completely off guard. There was no telling who would be affected by it or why. Those who suffered from it might be hypnotized or electrocuted, arrested or shot, all for the same illness. So many men were lost to it, there would be a revolution in military attitudes and a new field of medicine created. The condition was called shell shock.
These are the men whose minds the dead have ravished. Memory fingers in their hair of murders. Multitudinous murders they once witnessed.
The war on the Western Front was different from any war fought before. New machines dominated the fighting. Modern factories produced gas and high explosives, used for the first time on an industrial scale. Sustained shelling caused horrific injuries and dismemberment, testing the endurance of Britain's soldiers.
You were living in a land of impossibility, death, blood, mud, pouring with rain, boiled with sun. You could have run away for miles. And if I hadn't have had a command, I think I should have run away. I think I couldn't have stuck it.
No one, from new recruits to experienced officers, was prepared for trench warfare. Traditional ideas of courage and cowardice were slowly eroded as the misery of the conflict took its toll.
Every time a shell came back or dropped near you, you were on the shakes. But you got to try and control that. Some would laugh it off, others would be shaky or a bit nervous about it. But you got anybody who it seems to be a bit too frightened, you got to try and pat them on the back and say, "Come on, old boy, you're all right."
From the very outset, casualties were heavy. Soldiers returning from the front were overwhelmed by the brutality of this war. Dr. Charles Myers, a pioneering psychologist, was appalled by the suffering of trench warfare. In October 1914, he decided to offer his services to the military.
My father was very, very concerned about conditions out there, and he moved about from hospital to hospital, and in many cases he went up to the dressing stations very close to the firing line and saw these men directly they came out from the firing line, and he was pleased he was so near because he could undertake treatment for them straight away after their disasters with the bombs.
Soon after his arrival in France, Myers treated a private who had been trapped in barbed wire in no man's land. Although several shells had burst nearby, the soldier was untouched. But ever since the explosions, he had been partially blind. Myers was intrigued. He could find no physical cause for the man's condition. Other similar cases, mostly from the ranks, soon came to his notice. In February 1915, he reported his findings to the Lancet and concluded that the bursting of a shell had caused an invisibly fine molecular commotion in the soldier's brain. In other words, a physical shock to the nervous system had caused the strange symptoms. From this, he coined the term shell shock.
I suppose shell shock made much sense. It captured exactly what was happening. There were lots of shells around, there was lots of blast, lots of shock, and people, after being blown up or buried after being blown up, were in a state of shock. So I think it was a wonderful term because it described it quite perfectly.
To the Army's alarm, more and more cases of shell shock began to appear. After just 6 months of war, 15% of the British Army was judged to be suffering from the condition. The most extreme cases were blind, deaf, mute, or shaking, yet all without an apparent cause, other than their proximity to bombardment. Similar cases appeared in the French and German armies on the Western Front.
The shell shock are the symptoms of a mental person. All the signs and symptoms, shaking, head shaking, hands shaking, body shaking. They were, in other words, they weren't themselves. They had to be nursed, taken to the toilets and all that sort of business. They weren't fit to be left on their own. I mean to say, if you had a few shells bursting round you, you wouldn't feel so happy, would you?
The medical press highlighted the worrying number of cases. The British medical journals stirred up interest by reporting examples such as a sergeant with a paralyzed trigger finger who could no longer fire a rifle. The term shell shock became the common description for any soldier suffering an unexplained problem. Preventative measures had to be taken. In March 1915, the Army appointed Dr. Myers as consultant neurologist to deal with the growing problem. But Myers was already concerned that the term shell shock was a complete misnomer.
He found that many of the casualties who were labelled under that definition had never been near a bomb to suffer from the shell shock that most people feel associated with bombardment. And it was just their psychological problems that had accounted for the disastrous mental state.
Myers realized that the causes of shell shock were far more complex than he'd first thought. He was now convinced that shell shock was not a physical problem, but a mental one. Soldiers' unconscious minds so distressed by war crippled their bodies and took them out of the fighting. The military found it hard to accept such a radical theory. It undermined the belief that men could and should control their fears and emotions. Captain Herbert Leland was an officer in his mid-40s who had fought in numerous campaigns. From the trenches, he wrote almost daily to his wife, Lena. His letters are the personal testimony of a man's struggle to maintain his sanity.
I was at the front this morning. You could not believe the scene of desolation. Mud, muck, misery and melancholy reign supreme, and a pitiless bombardment adds to the general discomfort. Death and glory, I suppose they call it. All my friends are gone. Not a soul to go to, even for a chat. How I do wish I could tell you some things. I dare not, of course, for you would never get my letters.
One of the senior officers saw my grandfather and said, "Leland, these bombs don't seem to affect you." And he says, little does he know, but what is the point of hiding? You get used to it, but it still actually affects you very much.
When you see so much death, you obviously believe that perhaps the next bullet or the next barrage will have your name on it. And it is fearful. Some weeks, some people were frightfully brave, and yet the following week, they could hardly hold things together at all. It's a variable entity. Fear of death, fear of being afraid, seeing so much death. Really a nightmare. So how do you cope with it? I don't know. How do you prepare for it? I don't know. Perhaps you can't.
By the end of 1915, the British Army had suffered 500,000 casualties. 13,000 were diagnosed as shell-shocked. The milder cases were treated by Myers and his colleagues in France. The more severely affected men, referred to by the Army as noisy mental cases, were sent back to Britain. At first, the men were treated as if they were lunatics and therefore incurable. But at Myers' urging, special shell-shock hospitals were set up. One of these was the Royal Victoria Military Hospital at Netley in Hampshire. The aim was to segregate shell-shocked men and to test new methods of treatment.
We used to walk across the fields to the hospital, and these fields were all covered in tents. There was hundreds of these tents. And my mother used to keep on to me, "Shh, shh, don't make a noise." "Well, why, Mum, why?" "Well, they're shell-shock patients and they can't stand the slightest sound."
This footage, filmed at the Royal Victoria at the height of the war, is an extraordinary record of the impact of war on the minds of men. The doctors, feeling their way, decided that the men were suffering from hysterical conversion symptoms. That is, the men's mental distress produced a physical symptom: rigid limbs, extreme shivering, or loss of speech. In this case, a deaf man responds only to the word bomb.
Somehow the mind splits itself off from the body, that they're almost two distinct entities. And we see this after exposure to very traumatic and upsetting events. We know that some of the war psychiatrists talk about people going blind because they just can't bear seeing the carnage around them.
The doctors at Netley began to classify the different symptoms. They gave their patients' conditions outlandish names: hysterical dancing gait, hysterical slippery ice gait, and battling with the wind. Treatment at this stage was basic: massage, bed rest, and a milk diet. As a new phenomenon, shell shock sparked enormous interest in the medical community. Everyone wanted to find a cure, and the army gave doctors a free hand. In July 1916, the Battle of the Somme began on the Western Front. 20,000 men died on the first day. In 5 months, over 500,000 Allied troops were wounded or killed.
For miles, in every direction, it was just desolation. When you first see it, you think, my God, what's this? Everything's swept to the ground, just piles of bricks, tree stumps sticking up for miles and miles. The whole of the Somme area, to me, was like that.
Death? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It's the first time I'd ever seen death. It was so shocking on the first time that one, and then after that it was, I'm not going to be this. I'll run away from it sort of business because you never ever did, of course. And you see, in my case, I was in charge of a large number of men.
Now officers, who had not been affected in large numbers, were beginning to break down when confronted by the loss of so many of their men. Guy Botwright was a platoon commander in the Labour Corps, in charge of 36 men. He was 17 years old.
I was probably censoring letters, and an explosion might have taken place. Something. I had a pencil, you see, and it would have been, I would have dropped everything, and the mind would have gone blank. And I think that's what must have happened, because I can't tell you, waiting in the trench for something to come along to take me away. I had no pain, so there was no feeling of pain, because I hadn't been wounded or in any shape or form. But I couldn't concentrate. I've no idea what the doctors gave me for it. I couldn't tell you. Because the world had ceased to exist, I think.
Guy Botwright was diagnosed with shell shock. He was evacuated to a specialist officers' hospital in Brighton. Officers' shell shock often differed from the other ranks. Stammering, loss of memory and irritability were all common symptoms. Captain Leland wrote to his wife,
I feel I'm an awful wreck these days. The weather does not suit me. I'm sorry to say that my temper is such that few come near me. Just as well. I should love to get some leave, but I don't like to ask. It was suggested to me the other day, but in such a way that if I had risen to it, I should have felt that I was shirking.
You could see from his letters he was crying out to be given a rest, given a break. Had he been given a break, he probably would have been able to continue indefinitely. But without that break, you see it getting worse, getting through to him.
Shell shock was creating a loss of manpower. And this slowly but surely became more and more obvious, but it became blindingly obvious at the Battle of the Somme, when 35,000 men broke down. And the army authorities could not ignore this anymore. They had actually been working towards this. The work of Myers and others had been treating and were treating people successfully up until this time. But this was the real major loss. It had been learned from previous wars that disease, injuries, they could certainly cut your manpower down. But now they had to accept that the psychological response to warfare could do the same.
In response to the crisis, the War Office took action. More specialist hospitals were opened throughout the country. Moss Side Military Hospital at Maghull in Liverpool had room for 500 patients, all from the ranks. Under Dr. Richard Rouse, a Freudian psychologist, a team of doctors were recruited to treat the shell-shocked men. The army, usually conservative in such matters, was so desperate for a solution to the problem that they were happy to place their faith in the new treatment. The Maghull doctors believed that the cause of the men's condition was a traumatic event, which had been repressed and now lurked in their unconscious. The trauma might be revealed through the analysis of their dreams.
The theory suggested that if you recounted your tale, if you recounted your nightmares, if you talked about it, felt the emotion with the story, you could let it go. It would somehow lose its power of control over you.
Dream analysis seemed to work. In 1916, Richard Rouse, the medical superintendent at Maghull, wrote about his methods in The Lancet. He described one man who was tormented by a fearful nightmare. In his sleep, he was heard to shout, "It was an accidental shot. Yes, Major, it was not my fault." Exploring the man's unconscious mind revealed his terrible secret. It emerged that the man had mistakenly shot a wounded comrade crawling back to the lines through no man's land. After unburdening himself of this memory, the patient was healed. It was the birth of the talking cure.
The psychoanalysts had to probe deeper and deeper, which made it very terrible for those looking on, which was a sister or staff nurse.
Mary Jolly worked alongside the psychoanalysts at another military hospital, the Radcliffe in Nottingham. She helped nurse the most traumatized.
Many of them were being asked questions that were distressing them very much. But the psychoanalysts had to get to know what was causing the trouble. There was one instance where the psychoanalyst was trying to get out of the man's mind, and he was having great difficulty in probing. And in the end he got it out that he had seen tanks go into battle, and lying in the path of the tanks was wounded men. They just mowed over them. They had to go on. Your emotions were disturbed too, you know, because they disturbed you. You know, it was a painful thing to see a man quite out of control. Not good to see a man in tears. And you had to be there. That was distressing for those looking on.
Many of the Maghull doctors, like psychologist Tom Peer, developed a genuine sympathy for their patients. Working-class men who, in peacetime, they would never have had the opportunity to treat.
My father felt very deeply for them, there's no doubt about that. And he would tell you of a particular case and this man's background and the sort of family that he came from, and that the families would not understand. This was the sad thing, that even when the chap was so-called cured, and some of them went back to the front and some of them didn't, but he was afraid that their families would never be able to understand what had happened.
The revolutionary methods pioneered at Maghull were a success. 2/3 of those discharged were declared fit, only to be sent back to the slaughter. The Maghull doctors never forgot that curing a patient might send him back to the very cause of his breakdown, the fighting in France. It was an ethical dilemma at the heart of their work.
I think my father would have been extremely unhappy at the idea that this medical treatment that he was helping to give would be used in order to sign them off as fit and send them back to the trenches. I'm quite sure it would be a very sad thing, but he didn't talk about that. And in a way, of course, that hospital was run as a military hospital. He was under military discipline.
The army was always concerned, with some justice, that men might be faking shell shock in order to escape military service.
This man pretended that he couldn't keep food down. He vomited back any meal that he was given. And he didn't lose weight. And he was seen to get a parcel of food over the fence. His wife had come on one side of the fence, so that he was not undernourished. And that was why he wasn't losing weight. That was malingering.
The problem was that without an obvious physical wound, it was very difficult to tell the difference between a man who was shirking and one who had genuine symptoms of mental distress.
Of course, the real debate is whether this is unconscious or consciously created. And I think that's where a lot of the difficulties came along. Were these people malingering? This is a great theme throughout military psychiatry. And all of the psychiatrists I've read say that malingering was rare.
In June 1916, the War Office formally recognized that shell shock was a genuine war wound and had ordered that the condition should be treated as such. But unofficially, many continued to regard it as no more than cowardice. A case of shell shock could devastate the morale of a unit. Senior officers feared it was contagious, and harsh measures were often taken to prevent it from spreading.
The officer perhaps in charge of a group, and one fella cracks up, he's got to, the officer has got to be careful or to watch that the rest of his men don't crack up with him. There have been cases, I believe, even of men being shot by their officer for absolute cowardice, which the poor fella can't help it, but he's just broken down.
Although shell shock was now recognized by the War Office as a medical illness, it could not be used as a form of defense at a court-martial. A soldier charged with cowardice or desertion was either insane or responsible for his actions and should be shot. Private Harry Farr was a 26-year-old Londoner serving with the 1st West Yorkshire Regiment. He had been in France since the outbreak of war and had spent months in the trenches.
In May 1915, Father was put into hospital at Le Havre, and he was suffering from shell shock. Well, he'd always written to Mother and kept her posted of how things were going, but the letters that came from him in the hospital, he had to dictate to the nurse because he was so traumatized, his hands were shaking so much, he just couldn't write the letter. And that was the last letter that Mother ever got from my father.
Farr was returned to the front to fight at the Somme. There he felt his nerves giving way once again. In September 1916 he broke down and refused to go up the line to the trenches at Guillemont. He was charged with cowardice and court-martialed in October. At the court-martial, Farr defended himself.
I reported to the Sergeant Major and told him I was sick and could not stand it. He then said, "You are a sodding coward and you will go to the trenches. I give sod all for my life and I give sod all for guns and I'll get you sodding well shot."
When he was court-martialed, I think it was because he refused this time to actually go over the top. Not because he didn't want to fight, I'm sure of that, because he'd been out in France for 2 years, but because he didn't want to, he just couldn't face the gunfire, and he just felt so traumatized by it all that he just couldn't face it. He said himself in his own defense that when he was away from the gunfire, he felt all right.
The fact that Farr had spent 5 months in hospital in 1915 with shell shock and had been in and out of dressing stations since that time with nervous problems was not admissible during the trial. He had no other defense. Harry Farr was found guilty of cowardice. The court-martial lasted only 20 minutes.
The charge of cowardice seems clearly proved. The man is definitely bad, to say the least of it. I therefore recommend that the sentence be carried out.
Mother received a letter from the War Office stating that my father had died and that he had been shot for cowardice on October the 18th, 1916, and that was all. No apology, no nothing, just a letter. And she says she has told us since that she was so shocked, she had a blouse on at the moment, and she pushed this letter down in between the blouse, and she never told a soul.
Shortly after receiving the letter, Mrs. Farr got some solace from her vicar, who had been contacted by the padre attending the execution.
There was a padre there that stood there and watched my father when he was shot, and he said my father stood there open-eyed, refused a blindfold, and he said he was no coward, he was a very brave soldier.
The shame of his execution remained with Gertrude Farr for the rest of her life. She kept it secret until shortly before her death at the age of 99. Shell shock was not a problem confined to the British trenches. All armies faced the problem of weeding out malingerers and treating genuine cases. Yet as the war progressed, treatments improved. German doctors favored hypnotism. This German soldier is being treated for extreme and continuous shaking. In France, a different type of therapy was used. It was called Faradization, after the Englishman Faraday, who discovered electricity. Currents of electricity were applied to the affected areas and produced remarkable results. Faradization quickly caught on in Britain. At the forefront of the treatment was Dr. Louis Yeeland.
The basis of my father's treatment was to convince the patient that they were not deaf, they were not mute, or as the case may be, they were not paralyzed. And I suppose he did this in two ways, one by talking, and secondly by demonstrating that the patient could speak, could hear, or could move a limb with various techniques such as electrical stimuli.
As with the French, electricity stimulated the nerve endings, proving to the patient that his paralyzed limbs or vocal cords could and would work. Almost all those treated were cured, for the time being at least. Dr. Yeeland's use of electricity was so effective that he was regarded as a miracle worker. In his memoirs, he recalls the case of A1, a private aged 24, so traumatized by 3 years of combat that he was mute. For 9 months he had not spoken a word. Finally, the patient was sent to Yeeland, who locked the surgery doors and placed an electric probe in his throat.
I said firmly to him, "You will leave the room when you are speaking. You are already doing splendidly, and I am satisfied that you are now determined to talk, and I'm very pleased with you." I firmly held him in the chair and said to him, "It is getting late. I may have to use a stronger current."
One must remember at the time, the aims of treatment were partly to get patients better as quickly as possible in the hope that some would be able to return to duty, and long periods of psychoanalysis would not achieve that aim. I mean, the alternative was, if these patients didn't get better, they might spend the rest of their lives as invalids.
I then applied shock after shock to the posterior wall of the pharynx, commanding him each time to say "ah" in expiration. I continued with the Faradism until he could repeat "ah" distinctly, and I did not discontinue its use until he was able to repeat any letter or any word I ordered him to say. When he was able to repeat the days of the week, he became very pleased. "Doctor, doctor, I'm champion," he said.
Confidence in the ability to cure the most difficult cases was growing. No matter how extreme the physical symptoms, British doctors felt able to meet the challenge. In 1917, a charismatic new doctor arrived at the Royal Victoria Hospital, Arthur Hurst. He favored hypnotism. His treatment had dramatic results. Hurst looked after some of the men filmed here and kept detailed notes of their progress. Corporal Anderson had developed a curious walk after falling ill in Salonika. Dr. Hurst wrote,
"He found he could not walk owing to the pain, but he could get along by a sort of dancing gait in which he slid each foot backwards about half a pace every time it touched the ground. I explained to him that the gait, which had at first been the means of saving him from pain, had now become a bad habit, and that he must now try and cure himself by copying every movement I made when I walked. By the next morning, greatly to his delight, he was walking quite normally, and now found it difficult to reproduce his old dancing gait.
But some men were so deeply troubled by their experiences, they were beyond help.
Some of the sisters had a birthday, and they said it was a pity they had no drink. And one girl said she would get on her bicycle and go down and get a bottle of something, I don't know what. And when she was coming back, she heard a sort of coughing noise, and she thought, I'd better go and investigate what that is. Halfway she thought, oh no, it's a sheep or something. However, she did go over, and when she went over, she found that man had cut his throat. She had a petticoat on, a pair of scissors, and she burned him up as well as she could, and then she got on her bicycle and went back to the hospital. He was put on a charge, I suppose. He was in bed and his hands had to be outside the bedclothes all the time. And there was one probationer there that had to make do with what they had. And she was locking with one of the orderlies, and she took her eyes off the man, and he put his he had a tracheotomy done. And he put his hand and pushed his finger down, pushed his tube down the throat, died. Carelessness. Distressing, very distressing sometimes. Did what you could for them, diverted them perhaps was probably most of what you could do. And I was very young, I was only 24. I hadn't all the knowledge or the wisdom that I should have had.
Shortly before Christmas 1917, Captain Herbert Leland finally broke down. He was evacuated back to Britain.
You will be very sorry to see that I am in the officers' hospital. I don't know how you will take it, but personally I am very sick. The doctors insist on my having a complete rest away from the sound of guns, and I am to go home for at least a month. Don't worry, it is not my fault.
Being a proud military man, I think the effect of giving in to weakness and being taken out of the battle without being physically wounded was something that he was very ashamed of. And again, he's conscious that his wife and family might feel shame. It wasn't done.
The stigma of shell shock was such that officers were not meant to break down, but many, like Herbert Leland, did. These officers were found to be suffering from a neurosis that was born out of prolonged and exhausting exposure to war. Doctors called it neurasthenia. The use of this term helped avoid the more embarrassing diagnosis of shell shock on their medical records.
There obviously had to be an understanding of what was happening to not only the men, but the officer class as well. How could people with VCs, DSOs, how could they break down? So not just society, but more particularly perhaps the military hierarchy, had to try and come to some understanding as to what was happening.
Craiglockett Military Hospital for Officers on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Before the war, it was an asylum for the wealthy. As such, it was considered suitable for neurasthenic officers and was converted in 1916. The war poet Siegfried Sassoon was treated here in 1917. Sassoon described Craiglockett as a large mausoleum of a place, a live museum of war neuroses.
By night, the hospital became sepulchral and oppressive with saturations of war experience. One lay awake and listened to feet padding along passages which smelt of stale cigarette smoke. One became conscious that the place was full of men whose slumbers were morbid and terrifying. Around me was that underworld of dreams haunted by submerged memories of warfare and its intolerable shocks and self-lacerating failures to achieve the impossible.
One figure above all dominated Craiglockett, the psychologist William Rivers. Dr. Rivers believed that his patients should confront the horrors to which they had been subjected.
The basis of Rivers' approach was going back to the story, going back to the event. Not just telling the story, but the event with the emotion. That you had to have the emotion and the story to come to terms with the experience, to make peace with the experience, to accept it and move on in your life. Otherwise you would be stuck.
Rivers' central belief was that shell shock was the result of a conflict between self-preservation and the obligation to stay and fight. Soldiers became so worn down struggling between the two impulses that they became physically ill, especially after 4 long years of war. Rivers' ability to engage with these shattered young men earned their lasting respect, and in some cases, devotion. John Harry Burns was one of these men. He had been buried alive in a church during the bombardment of Arras in 1917. He had lost all but 2 of his 200 men and suffered a total mental collapse. He was sent to Craiglockett, where he was treated by Rivers and his team. From Craiglockett, he wrote,
"At present, my nerves are in a very poor state. The slightest noise affects my heart. I suffer very much through insomnia and also have acute pains in my head. I shall remain for a considerable time incapacitated."
Day trips and social activities were encouraged as part of the treatment. Burns' wife would often come and visit. But despite their best efforts, they could make little progress. Memories of the war continued to haunt Harry Burns.
His principal doctors felt that they just hadn't opened his mind at all. He was purposely closing it. And I think that's what he wanted to do was to find the men that he'd been lost with, that had lost with him that day, and there were about 200 of them, and to find their discs and find their bones and help in the burying of them.
Rivers suggested to Burns' wife that his only chance of recovery was to take him back to France to lay his ghosts to rest. The idea of actually revisiting the scene of past traumas grew out of Rivers' belief that men should not hide from their experiences. The end of the war in November 1918 gave Burns, and many others like him, the opportunity to make peace with themselves on the Western Front.
My mother and his sister willingly took him, and they were there for 6 months. And they met the Canadian War Graves Commission, and my father was able to stay back with the officer for some months. And they found a great number of the things he'd been fretting about, limbs and the identification discs of his men. it seemed it was his salvation. My mother always used to tell me that if it hadn't been for Craig Lockett, we might never have got Daddy back.
Rivers and his colleagues treating shell shock during the Great War changed forever the perception and treatment of the damaged mind. There was no longer a rigid distinction between the mad and the sane. Instead, there was a new understanding of temporary mental breakdown, to which anyone could fall victim.
Shell shock and the psychological reactions to the battlefields of the First War, I think for the first time allowed us to negotiate within society that external events could affect you internally, that perfectly normal, rational, brave, courageous human beings could be brought to tears, could mentally break down, lose their emotions, and actually regain control again.
Psychology then became much more popular, and people for the first time realized that psychology has a deep understanding of why people do what they do or don't do what they don't do, and that it's connected with all sorts of fears and angst and apprehension and dreams and that kind of thing. And I think for the first time, perhaps, people became interested in the mental troubles that ordinary people might have.
Some 200,000 men were shell-shocked during the war. Many were cured, but for others the awful memories of war continued to dominate their lives. In 1921, 3 years after the war, nearly 15,000 men were still in hospital. Others, like Harry Burns, had to cope as best they could.
My father never got over the terrible trauma of the war, but he was able somehow to keep it at bay pretty well. But I always remember his horrific shouting and screaming in the night. And it was really dreadful. And my mother trying to calm him down and everything, but of course I didn't see anything unusual about it. Went on every night and that was it. I thought everybody's daddy did things like that in the night. And cowered under the bed, and howled and screamed.
The Great War had devastated the nation, and in the years that followed, people tried to put their suffering behind them. The lessons about shell shock, so hurriedly learned during the war, were quickly put aside by the military in peacetime. Its new discipline, military psychiatry, lay dormant. But only 20 years after armistice, another conflict would break out, and once more, the horrors of war would ravish the minds of fighting men.
When Wilson comes to Versailles, and all the speeches he had given in America, and all the cables coming across the Atlantic, and everything that he had said, people were led to believe, and particularly the German delegation at Versailles, that they'll be treated fairly, equitably. Sure, there may be a little bit of victor's justice, but it wouldn't be this vindictive kind of victor's justice to get there and be presented with this. You guys caused the war, you're the sole cause of it, you're going to bear all the emotional, moral, and fiscal responsibility for the war that, as it says here, imposed upon us by the aggression of you and your allies. It's probably what led to the great insanity of the second time. When you find in the 1930s, Germany being the pariah state, meaning an outcast in the international community, and the Soviet Union being a pariah state, an outcast in the international community. In 1939, October 1939, Winston Churchill referred to the Soviet Union as a riddle, left aside an enigma, inside of a mystery. Because it's October 1939, which means that World War II has started. And now the question is, what are the Russians going to do? We haven't really talked to them in 20 years. Poland doesn't exist in October 1939 because the Germans took the western half and the Russians took the eastern half. What are we going to do? Clearly the Germans are not, the Nazis, let me start saying the Germans, the Nazi regime. The Nazis are not the people we want to talk to. So what about the Russians? And what about the war's impact, just a brief discussion, upon the United States? I tell my students sometimes when I'm feeling down, I just put this up to give myself a boost. In 1915, a couple years before the United States gets into the war, D.W. Griffith releases Birth of a Nation. I sometimes say that it has a similar cultural effect as Star Wars did when it first came out in 1977. If you all went to see the opening of Star Wars, you just remember how wonderful it was. You're sitting there, the movie theater's dark, you're sitting there waiting for the usual wind-up, the slow music come on and sort of take you sleepily into the story. There's nothing, then there's this boom, dun, 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 dun. I was sitting there with my eyebrows smoking. This was movies like I had never seen it before. George Lucas had introduced an entirely new way of making film. So did James Cameron with Avatar a few years ago. The technology, the screenshots, everything about making movies was going to be different from that point forward. So as a piece of cinema history, this is a landmark movie. It changed the way movies were going to be made. The story of the Ku Klux Klan coming to the rescue of the beleaguered South after the Civil War because it was being overrun by black troops. If you haven't seen the film, it's worthwhile watching. It's repugnant, but it is worth watching. The ironic thing is that the black people don't even get to play the black troops. It's white men dressed up in blackface. So, what does it mean you can't even get paid to malign yourself? But what this eventually leads to is a reviving of the Ku Klux Klan. Its numbers have been falling. So that 10 years later, in 1925, you'll find the Ku Klux Klan marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. In history, it's not, I believe, it's not sufficient enough just to say, here's what happened, and then here's the result. We have to always ask the question, why? And sometimes I use something like this. The Factory Act of 1833 that was passed in England. What does it mean about your society when you have to pass a law that says kids that, beneath the age of 8 years old are not allowed to work in a factory? Who are you? What is it about an 8-year-old kid you don't know about not working in a factory? That says something about those folk, that time, and those conditions. The mere fact that they had to pass a law to say that. In the 1930s, again connected to World War I. By 1934, of course, this is the time of the Great Depression. Many people, as the Great Depression went deeper and deeper and deeper, the market crashes in October 1929. 1932 is what they call the trough of the Depression. It can't get any lower. At least people were praying it couldn't get any lower. But in 1934, people were asking the usual question that human beings ask after the fact. How did this happen? And so there was a senator from North Dakota named Gerald P. Nye, who convened something called the Senate Munitions Committee because of widespread reports that manufacturers of armaments had unduly influenced the American decision to enter the war in 1917. In other words, these people, these armament suppliers, had so influenced or imposed upon poor Wilson to where they made him go to war. 53,000 battle deaths. So basically, look, people are hurting in the Great Depression. And people are asking, why is this happening? Why is this thing befalling me and the nation? People want answers. One possibility was that all that credit that was extended to European governments, the people who made out from all the arms manufacturing, 53,000 dead, they're the ones that set this up in the chain reaction. When people came calling in their markers for payment on the debt, and the Europeans could service it, and they couldn't get the Germans to pay up, then everything crashed. The Nye Committee, as it was called, held 93 hearings, questioning more than 200 witnesses, including J.P. Morgan and Pierre DuPont. They found little hard evidence of an active conspiracy among arms makers Yet the panel's interest report did little to weaken the popular prejudice against greedy munitions interests. And then we get to how the war impacted those leaders of the future. This gentleman is a cadet at West Point. His father's name was Arthur MacArthur. That's one of those names that is guaranteed to get you beat up on the playground. This cadet would go on to serve in World War I, be affected by it, shaped by it. As Chief of Staff for the Army, he would be the one in charge of using military force against the bonus marchers in the 1930s. Those World War I veterans, having done their duty, demand during the Depression that they want to be paid. General Douglas MacArthur, a World War I veteran. This is MacArthur, of course, wading ashore at Leyte Gulf. In 1944, some of you all may be aware, he goes ashore, grabs a radio and says, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The surrender with Emperor Hirohito here. This picture, you see the MacArthur's about 6'4". He's towering over Hirohito. And American victory is just cemented in this image. And of course, he goes on to be the senior commander in the early stages of the Korean War. He masterminds, or he at least plans the landing of Incheon, getting behind the North Korean forces, pretty much stops the North Korean invasion, sets up a stalemate, or runs afoul of his president, who says, you are a very popular and brilliant general, but I'm still the boss, and you're fired. This same president, Harry Truman, was himself an artillery officer in World War I, and this rather dashing fellow. Some of you are mentioning already, yes. Here he's giving inspiration to troops just before they take off for the D-Day landing on June 6, 1944. On the 11th day, the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month, and even including the polar bears, those are the polar bear expedition. When those men come back, because the polar bear expedition, they encounter similar circumstances like their counterparts in Europe, and then some, because they're not getting along with the Russians or the English. There's distrust, and they're far away from home, and it's cold to boot. The fact that when the war ends, you don't just rebuild those villages all at once. Those men come back broken, they come back minus limbs, they come back emotionally, physically, psychologically wounded. The legacy of World War I lives with them for the next 15, 20 years. So I get why Neville Chamberlain was in a negotiating mood. I wish he had done more. I get why Edouard Daladier was in a negotiating mood. I wish he'd done more. But I understand now why the Europeans were so devastatingly afraid of having yet another, possibly larger conflagration, because this time they've been paying attention. This time, the most recent land war they had in Europe was a world war of an industrial type that used all of chemistry, science, internal combustion engines, air, sea, beneath the sea, machine guns, air-cooled, water-cooled, the whole shot. And they knew that the advancement since then would be even worse. But the war came. I will take questions or comments. Observation, yes, sir.
Who started with the gas?
It was the Germans. The last time we were here, I introduced a gentleman named Fritz Haber, H-A-V-E-R. Actually, if you go to the computer, there's a show that comes on NPR called Radio Lab. Just right now, just type in Radio Lab, Fritz Haber, and it gives you a really, really good article about him. Fritz Haber, H-A-V-E-R. Yes, sir.
What has to happen to end the war that we're in?
What has to happen to end? Well, I'm trying. Let me. Which war are you talking about? Are you talking about what's happening with the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or depending upon how you choose to phrase it, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant? You talking about the drone strikes in Yemen? You talking about Afghanistan? Are you talking about the drone strikes in Waziristan? You know, I don't know. I really don't know. And I'm not being coy. I was at Bible study with a few colleagues this morning, and we were talking about this. You know, the word says, "Thou shalt not kill." But there are Christians who are being abducted in northern Nigeria by Boko Haram. Girls being abducted. ISIL is going around lopping off the heads of people that call themselves Christians. Now, there's a thing called just war theory, which pretty much recognizes the fact that there's evil in the world, there's evil in the world, and we acknowledge the fact that war is evil or sinful, and so we just accept that. So what level of this are we going to engage in? In other words, how can we knowing that and knowing that we're not going to come out of it with clean hands, what's the best way we can go about doing this to defend those who are too weak to defend themselves? And I don't know what that is. But I'll tell you this much. I think I mentioned this the last time. In the modern era, a modern war cannot be won without air power. But in the modern era, you cannot win a war only with air power. Understand? Every basic infantryman and infantrywoman understands this. You can smoke it, gas it, nuke it, flame it, bomb it. But until someone's standing on it, it's not yours. So right now we're nibbling around the edges. But something has to be done. And you have no idea. I'm holding my Marine Corps self back. Because my Marine Corps self has a very definite answer. Question over here, yes. Okay.
Do you believe that America got nothing out of World War I except death and thousands and thousands of wounded and ruined men?
Do I believe that America got nothing out of World War I except death, thousands and thousands of wounded, and wounded men? I'm hard pressed to say if you get anything out of any conflict, except maybe the victory. And sometimes it's a period victory. But I would say that if America got anything, just based on our discussion here, if we got anything, it at least was a wake-up call. American soldiers came home from World War I, because you understand, American soldiers went marching off to that war to bands and great fanfare too. They didn't go marching off to World War II like that. So they came home with an understanding that this was something new and different, and we really need to not do this again. That in part explains the isolationist movement during the 1930s. You know, people were going back to George Washington's farewell address and the warning about not getting involved in foreign entanglements. Well, for a time, Woodrow Wilson's name was being dragged through the mud because people said, well, Wilson wasn't smart enough to live up to George Washington's admonition. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but now we knew. So at a minimum, we at least had our eyes open with the rest of the world. Yes?
Between World War I and World War II, there was a practice war in Spain. We as a nation stayed out of that. Comment?
He mentioned that between World War I and World War II, there was a practice war in Spain. It was called the Spanish Civil War. And we officially stayed out of it, although there were Americans who did go to fight there. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade, or the Abraham Lincoln Legion, I can't remember, the brigade, I think. There were also Russians, people from the Soviet Union that came to fight there. So you have the fascist Franco, who was being backed by the Nazis. And here's the interesting thing. Some military historians have asserted that it was during the Spanish Civil War that the Nazis perfected their technique for blitzkrieg. During the 1930s, there were air races in Europe. And if you take a look at some of the aircraft that were flown in 1936 during that year's air races, the Spitfire Mark 9 and Mark 12 looked extremely similar to the plane that the British were flying in those air races. And the Messerschmitt 109 and 110, the Messerschmitt 109 and the Bf 109 looked strikingly similar to the ones entered in those air races. So It's sort of like British aircraft manufacturers and German aircraft manufacturers, William Messerschmitt and Company, saying, let's go to the air race, we just want to win.
Yeah.
But it was another one of those tests. The war lasted from 1936 to 1939, and by 1936, Germany was already rearming, and it was already directly involved in the Spanish Civil War, and the League of Nations one more time did nothing, which further emboldened Adolf Hitler to even ask for demand more land. And of course, Franco won the war and set up a fascist dictatorship in Spain for at least the next 30, 40 years. Other questions? Yes, sir.
In the section about shell shock, okay?
Yes.
I understand PTSD, but I've never experienced anybody that suffered shell shock after World War I. I mean, am I missing something? Or, I mean, why is there a big, I mean, I never saw people like that.
You mean with the twitching and all that?
Yeah. He's not old enough. I love you, bro.
The question is, relative to the section on cell shock, how come those guys are twitching? I've never seen anybody have a reaction like that. And Merle responded, you're not old enough yet. My understanding of shell shock, as it was experienced by those soldiers, was because of the tremendous sustained bombardment. Okay? You go through hours and hours of shells raining down on you, feeling the ground shaking. I'll give you just a very brief example. And of course, this doesn't even begin to scratch the surface and approach what these guys went through. But on a field operation in 29 Palms, California, in the desert, we were moving in a column, and I was the tip of the point of the spear of the column. And I had my radio man over here, we're running across with a weapon in his hand, we're running full speed across the desert. We called it an airstrike. 2 A-6s come in at 0 altitude and lay down 2 1,000-pound bombs. About a mile or two in front of us. The ground shook like it fell right on top of us. 2 1,000-pound bombs, between a mile and 2 miles in front of us. Now, as I think about that, 2 1,000-pound bombs, 2 miles in front of us, if those are shells raining down on top of me, and it need to be on top of me, if I'm still remembering what the ground felt like beneath my feet from that years ago, I cannot even begin to imagine how this must have shaken up literally shaken their insides up, to where when you finally come out of that environment, the body's more accustomed to being shaken and jarred and twitching, to where not doing it is the abnormal thing. That's my guess. I have to check. There's a number of wonderful websites you can go to research this relative to World War I, and it's just amazing reading about how there was this really macho, manly thing. Get back out there and do your duty. They really did not understand. Yes?
Nowadays you hear a lot of veterans who golf in that area there when they get close to a lot of explosions. They're getting up close and personal with them. They're wearing body armor nowadays. They're surviving stuff that we never used to survive before.
Right.
A lot of people come out of that, they lose their limbs, but they also have what they call TBIs, who have brain injuries. And I wonder how much of the World War I you had to have had that. And for the shaking and stuff like that, I was wondering how much actual physical effect was with the psychological.
You know what? I don't have any evidence to back this up, and I haven't done research on it. But just the very nature of war says to me that in every conflict, let's just start with let's go from the American Revolution forward. Because you're getting to modern warfare. It's sort of like primitive modern warfare then, of course, with the Civil War. But you have men, women who go through those kind of experiences cannot just leave those behind. So every war per its era is going to leave something behind in its wake. And it just so happens that in World War I and World War II, the wars we've had since then, they have been so awful, they have been so intense to where we're more immediately aware of it. Now, after the Civil War, you have a lot of amputees because of the nature of medicine. So they've been through something, but psychologically, emotionally, again, I'm not even so sure that even the field of psychology was even born or matured enough yet to even start talking about that kind of stuff. I don't think it was. Yes.
One more quick one.
Go ahead.
If you look at the starting say Revolutionary War towards Civil War, though, the length of time that a soldier was in actual combat kept increasing after
That's
that.
right.
The period that he was in combat itself, and the Civil War itself, it actually increased quite a bit.
That's
And
right.
after the World War II, I don't know if you've heard of a gentleman named S.L.A. Marshall. Did some studies.
Right.
And he found that the soldiers in World War II, that they were good theoretically up to about 100 and some odd days of actual combat.
Mhm.
After that, the process took over, and psychologically, they could get conflict.
We're talking about that S.L.A. Marshall and other military theorists have done studies showing trying to figure out just how functional can a soldier be. How many days? Does 100 days? 100 days before they begin to deteriorate emotionally into not being good for combat. To give you an idea of where warfare is going, just bear with me for a second. Marine Corps and the Army are already looking at these to carry equipment in the field. As we watch this, I want you all to think about this. Now, just like humanity wasn't prepared to fight a war with 5 brand new weapon systems that came all at once, or maybe they weren't prepared but they were surprised by it, what happens if we find ourselves in a conflict when, in addition to drones, command, the control, the communications, and the intelligence, C3I. They're developing exoskeletons for soldiers to wear that will increase their ability to lift things, withstand blasts. We're going to change our definition of warfare. Just like now, drone pilots sitting in New Mexico, 9,000 miles away from the target they're attacking, they still talk about stress disorder from hitting wrong targets. What does this mean for warfare? What is this? If we're having machines that can do this, does this mean we go to war faster? If it becomes less costly in human life? Do we just deploy faster because it's not actually us going? So if we change our definition of warfare, do we change our definition of what's legitimate target? Do we redefine collateral damage? That troublesome term. Do we have to engage in a larger philosophical discussion about what it means to be a human being? just prototypes right now. They're actually, you see this? Let's get that suit on. They're talking about using these kind of systems to go into burning buildings, to pull out human beings, or for bomb disposal. And those all, I have no doubt they will use them for that. So we have some talking to do. We have some discussions to have as a nation, as a people. Yes, yes, sir.
You talked about what's necessary for and what do you think the impact has on the current conflicts, the fact that we have volunteer army in this country, you know, and I'm actually going to places that's got a whole other way of conscripting. So different groups of different impact that has on.
Very quickly, what do I think having? We used to have a draft. You are aware we had a draft during Vietnam, and because of Vietnam, we went to what they call the AVF, the All Volunteer Force. We now have one of the best, highly motivated militaries on earth. It is. They've proven themselves. They do the job. They want to be there. They're smart, and they sign up because they want to be there or because they have the option to be there. Life circumstances. The problem with that, though, is that particularly with the way we have fought the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'll use World War II as an example, not so much Vietnam, but even Vietnam too. In Vietnam, World War II, every prior conflict, as far as I can understand it, more people had more skin in the game. When you have such a small segment of your population, which is doing all the heavy lifting, and I can go spend my afternoon at the mall, or fishing, and not know there are wars going on, and therefore not care about it, and not suffer from it, then what do I care about what the government's doing with those people who are volunteering? What do I care about what those people are doing, sending other young people's children to combat? So we ended up with a very high quality military force, but we're disconnected from it. And there's not that shared risk anymore that has been present in other conflicts that we have experienced. And I don't know what that means. Certainly it is not, it is nothing against our military. I'm very praiseworthy of our military. But I'm always curious about people that say, you know, we love our vets, but the funding is cut for veterans hospitals and other things for veterans. And the GI Bill gets whittled away and so on and so forth. So we love you as long as you're young and healthy and not disturbed yet. We have to answer why the situation at the Grand Rapids Veterans Home is the way it is. We have to answer that. Our veterans, anybody that's worn a uniform, male, female, otherwise, should not be living in conditions like that if they have put their neck on the line to defend this Constitution. And with that, I thank you all for a very, very good day.